In this lecture, we're going to do two interesting things. First, we will loop over an array backwards, and then second, we will also create a loop inside another loop. So let's have some more fun with arrays now. And so let's get back our array again here. So the Jonas array, and let's forget about this element here. And so now, as I said in the beginning of this video, let's now loop over this array backwards. So the first element that we want to print is this one, then this, and finally Jonas. So essentially, in the last lecture, we looped from the beginning. So we started with index 0, then 1, all the way to 4, right? But now we want to start at 4. Then we want to go to 3 and all the way to 0, which is going to be the last index. So this one is 4 and this one is 0. And so now we need to create the for loop according to this new information. So basically according to this new methodology. So let's start again with the counter, and we'll name it I again. But now what should be the initial value of the counter? And we already replied to that question kind of, so it should be 4. But should we just write the 4 here? No, we shouldn't, right? Because we already learned that hard-coded values like this are not a good idea. So what is 4? Well, 4 is basically just the length of the array, which is 5 minus 1. So that's exactly what we will write here. Jonas.length minus 1. Then the condition, and when do we want the loop to stop? Well, it should stop after the 0. And so the condition we need to write, remember, is telling JavaScript in which condition the loop should keep running. And so basically the loop should keep running as long as the counter is still above 0. So I should be greater or equal, actually, 0. So let's quickly simulate that. So at number 4, which is in the beginning, I is greater or equal 0, right? So this condition will be true. And so the next iteration will run. Then we need to decrease the index or the counter. And so let's actually do that as well. And so instead of using I++, which we used before to increment the value, we use minus minus to decrement or to decrease the value by 1. And so now we move from 4 to 3. And 3, of course, still is greater or equal 0. Then all the way to 0. And so 0 is still greater or equal 0. Then the counter gets updated again, and it will be updated to minus 1. And now minus 1 is not greater or equal 0. So this is false, and so the loop will stop. Okay, so I hope that this was not hard. Really, all we have to do is to think when we create these 3 parts here of the for loop. And I hope that you could follow my train of thought here. Now anyway, the rest, of course, is going to work just exactly the same. So we're getting, again, the current element. So let's check that very quickly. And yes, great job, it works. And just to really show it, let's also log the counter variable itself. So first the I, so the counter, and then the array value. And so indeed, this works just as we intended. We start with number 4, just as we have it here. And then we move to 3, 2, 1, 0. And if we now edit one element, then for sure, this is going to work just the same. Because now Jonas length is 6 and minus 1 is 5. And so it will start here at true. And indeed, it does. All right. Now you will probably not be doing this all the time in your own code, but I thought that this was a nice exercise so we could again think about how to define the counter, the condition, and the counter update. Okay, so that was the first part of this lecture. And now I want to show you how we can create a loop inside of a loop. So does that sound crazy? Well, it's not so crazy. And it's not so difficult either. And to do this, let's go back to our gym example from the first loop lecture. So there we had 10 repetitions for a certain weightlifting exercise. Remember? But now let's say that we have 3 different exercises and we want to repeat each of them 5 times. So that means a total of 15 repetitions, 5 for each of the 3 exercises. So to log all these exercises, we will need a loop inside a loop. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work here. And we're going to start with the 3 exercises. So let's create a counter, and I will actually call it exercise. So exercise, and we start at 1 now this time again, because we simply want to log exercise 1, 2, and 3. So our condition here is that the exercise should be less or equal 3. And actually this would be exactly the same as writing exercise below 4. So you can do whatever you prefer most. And I think I will actually stick with this one this time. And then we need to increase the exercise after each iteration as always. So now let's log to the console something like this. Starting exercise. And actually here we want to include the exercise number. So let's instead create a template literal. And so here we use that counter variable. So let's just check this one. So we have 3 exercises, but we don't have any repetitions yet in there. And so now, again, we need to create a loop inside a loop so that in each exercise, we can have the 5 repetitions that we want. And the repetitions themselves are a loop, right? And so that's why we now need that loop inside of this loop. So let's do that. And this is going to be basically the same as we did earlier. So let's again call it rep, start at 1, and then the condition. So remember how I said that we want 5 repetitions this time. And so let's say we want to stay below 6. So again, that would be exactly the same as writing less or equal 5. But let's keep it a bit different this time and say below 6. And then rep plus plus. And now lifting weights, repetition. And again, I forgot to make this a template literal. So yes, this should work much better. And now this cute emoji here again. Oh, where is it? And let's test this now. So what do you expect to see? Think about that before you load your own result or before I load here the result. So, is this what you expected? Let's even increase this here a little bit. And now we see the full picture. All right, so we start exercise number 1, which is what we have here. And then inside of this iteration of exercise 1, a new loop is created and executed. And so that's what then creates this lifting weights repetition from 1 to 5. All right. Then this loop here is finished, right? So it run all the 5 times, and then this first iteration is finished. And so the exercise loop, so this outer loop here, goes to its second iteration. And so we are at exercise number 2. And then this whole loop here will run again from 1 to 5. So that's these 5 here. And then that loop again finishes, and then the exercise iteration finishes, and we go to iteration number 3. So exercise is now number 3, and then the whole repetition loop, so this inner loop here, will run 5 times again. And with that, we end up with a total of basically 15 repetitions, just as I said in the beginning. So 3 times 5. Okay, and we could even include the number of the current exercise in this string that we're printing here. So let's do that as well. Exercise, and then exercise. So this is the variable that we get from the outer loop. And so this variable here is of course available inside this whole loop. And that does include all the inner code, even this inner loop. And so that's why we can access this variable here as well. And so now we should see exercise 1 printed for these 5, then exercise 2 printed for these 5, and exercise 3 for the last ones. And yeah, beautiful. All right. I think this was a very fun exercise. And again, even though you might not use this all the time in the real world, I still think that this was a pretty cool example to show you some more power of loops. And now to wrap up this section, all there is left to learn is another type of loop, which is the while loop. All right, so we learned all about the for loop and even created a loop inside a loop. But there is another type of loop in JavaScript, and that's the while loop. So let's explore that one now. And to understand how the while loop works and the difference between the for and the while loop, let's actually go back to our first for loop lecture and get back the code of this weightlifting exercise. So just copy this, and we will keep it for comparison, basically. So let's put it back to 10 here as well. And so let's now do the same thing with a while loop. So implementing the same with a while loop, we still need the same components. So we still need a counter so that we can then actually print the current value to the console. We still need a condition so that we know when to stop. And we still need to increase the counter somehow. Now in a while loop, it works a bit differently because for the while loop, we can only specify a condition. So while, and then just the condition is the only thing that we can specify here. So that's going to be exactly the same as this one. So we want to keep the loop running while repetitions is less or equal 10. And that's actually why this loop is called while. So again, it's called the while loop because it will run while this condition is true. All right, but now we need to kind of manually, so more explicitly define the other two components of the for loop. So the repetitions and the increasing of the counter. And so we need to do that basically outside. So we start at the beginning with rep equal 1. Then we have the condition. Then let's put the code that we want to execute. And then at the end of the iteration, we will then increase the counter. And so let's just do that. So at the end of the iteration is basically the end of this code block. And so let's do that there. And that's it. And so now we should get the exact same result twice, once coming from this for loop and once coming from this while loop. And yeah, so 1 to 10, and then again 1 to 10 coming from the while loop. Just write that here, just to make 100% sure. Yeah, and indeed, the second set here is coming from the while loop. So This all means that the while loop is more versatile than the for loop, which means that it can be used in a larger variety of situations. And that's because it does not really need a counter. So we put the counter here because we need it for this specific use case. But all the while loop really needs is the condition, which needs to stay true for it to keep running. And that condition can be any condition. It doesn't have to be related to any counter at all. And sometimes that's exactly what we need to solve a certain problem. So a problem without any counter. So without a number that is increasing. And so let's create such an example here. So I will start by taking off this for loop. We no longer need that one. And now we will do a simple example that does not depend on a counter, but instead it will depend on a random variable. Okay? So what we're going to do is to basically roll a dice and then keep rolling the dice until we roll a 6. And then when we roll a 6, we stop. So essentially, we will want to keep running the loop while the rolled dice is different from 6. And so in this case, we do actually not know beforehand how many times the loop should run. And so we don't need a counter variable. And that's exactly the use case of a while loop. So let's start by creating that random number. And so the roll of a dice is a number between 1 and 6. The way that we implement this does not matter at this point. Okay? We will learn more about random numbers at a later point. And so for now, basically just type what I am writing here. So we're using math.random, and this will create a number between 0 and 1. Then we multiply that by 6, but this is going to be a decimal number. Let me just show that to you quickly, because I think this is still interesting for you. So you see that it's a decimal number, and so now we need to get rid of this decimal part. And so that we do using math.trunc. And so this will give us a number between 0 and 5, and then we add 1 and get 1 to 6. So again, don't worry about the implementation of this at this point. We will do this again later. But what matters here is that as we reload the page, we get a random number here that is different every time. And so it will be different for you, of course. So different from what you see in the video as you keep reloading your own page. Okay, and so now let's do what I explained earlier. So again, we want to keep running the loop until we roll a 6. So until this dice variable here holds the value of 6. And so the condition of the loop is now going to be dice different from 6. And as soon as the value is 6, it will stop. And let's log the value to the console here. So you rolled a and then dice. And so let's get rid of this one here. And now let's log it to the console. But keep in mind that actually right now we are only creating one dice value. So at this point the loop doesn't make a lot of sense. And so actually let's keep working on this before we test it. So again, we are only creating one random number between 1 and 6 here, right? And if that's different than 6, this loop here will run. But right now, the loop would then run forever, which I'm not going to show you here now because that would crash the browser. So this would be called an infinite loop, and we don't want that. So what we will do is to keep creating new dice values. And so we are going to reassign this value at the end of each iteration. And so now we're ready to test the result here. Whoa, you see we got a lot of dice rolls here. Let me actually also comment out just this console.log here. And so of course your result will be different from mine because we are using different random numbers. But anyway, let's analyze what happened here. So we start with some random dice number, and then here we check if that dice is different from 6. And apparently it was different. And so then we entered the loop, which then logged you rolled a 2. So my random number was first a 2. Then in the next line, we created a new random number, and then the loop ran again. So again, this condition was tested. So is the dice different from 6? And apparently it was. And so we entered the loop again. And so it printed you rolled a 1. And then the next dice was a 5, and then the next one was a 4. But then apparently the next dice that was rolled here was a 6. So at the end of this iteration here, this dice value was a 6. And so then in the next iteration, dice was actually equal 6. And so then the condition is no longer true and the loop stopped. And let me actually write one more line of code here in which we can say if dice is 6, then log loop is about to end. And so this way we can know when a 6 happened. And so the very first thing that should ever happen here in this output is this, right? Because then when the dice was 6, the next iteration will no longer run. So let's do that. And indeed, so we get 1, 5, 4, 1, but no 6. And then loop is about to end. And so the dice was 6. And so this condition was true. And so we saw this log to the console. And then in the next iteration, again, 6 equals 6. And so the loop finished. Let's try some more times. And of course, it works. Oh, and now we get the situation where the first dice ever was a 6. And so the loop never even started. And this was the situation I was waiting for here. So when dice is 6 right away in the beginning, then of course this loop will have exactly 0 iterations. It will never start. Okay? And so the conclusion of this is that the while loop does really not have to depend on any counter variable. So whenever you do need a loop without a counter, you can reach for the while loop. So basically, that happens whenever you do not know beforehand how many iterations the loop will have. So in that situation, the while loop is the right tool for the job. And that's exactly what we had here. So we had no way of knowing how many times we would roll a dice that's different from 6. Now, on the other hand, when we do know how many times the loop will run, that means that we're going to actually need a counter. For example, when we want to loop over an array, we already know how many elements that array has, and so we know how many iterations we will need. And therefore, the for loop is usually the right choice to loop over an array. All right, and with this, we kind of finished the JavaScript fundamentals. All there's left to do now is for you to complete the final coding challenge of this section. And here goes the final coding challenge of this section. And in this one, let's improve the tip calculator that we created earlier, but this time using loops. So here is what I want you to do. First, create an array called builds, which will contain the 10 test values that we have down here. Then create empty arrays for both the tips and the totals. And so these arrays should be called tips and totals. And if you need more details about this challenge, you can always go back to the code of the previous version that we wrote of this. Then in number 3, use the calc tip function that we wrote before. And so go back to that challenge really and copy the function from there. There's no need to repeat the same code. So use that function to calculate both the tips and the total values for every single bill value that is in the bills array we created in number 1. And to do that, of course, use a for loop, just as we learned over these few last lectures. And my hint to help you a little bit with this in case you need it is to call the calcTip function inside the loop and then use the push method to keep adding values to the tips and the totals arrays. All right, so that's the basic challenge, and hopefully you can solve it even if you need to consult the code that we wrote earlier. That's absolutely no problem. So there's no need to memorize anything. All you need is to understand. And so if you understood what we did up until this point, you should be able to look at the code that we wrote and then change that in order to fit this challenge. Now, if you want to challenge yourself even more and basically push what we learned to the limit, then I have a bonus question. And here I want you to write a function calcAverage, which will take any array called R as an argument. And this function will calculate the average of all the numbers in the array that it received. Now let me tell you that this is a very difficult challenge for you at this point, because we haven't done anything like this before. Okay? So if you don't want to get frustrated or something, then there's no need to try this one. You can just watch the solution at the end of this video. But if you still want to attempt how to do it, here are the steps how to solve it to make it a bit easier. So first of all, you will need to add up all the values in the array that the function receives. And to do that, you start by creating a variable called sum and set it to 0. And then you will loop over the array using a for loop. And in each iteration, you will add the current value of the array to the sum variable. And by doing this, you will end up with all the values in the array added together. And then to calculate and return the average, all you have to do is to divide the sum that you just calculated by the length of the array, because that is the number of elements. So for example, if the array had just two values, like 10 and 20, we would add them together, they would be 30, and then divided by the number of elements in the array. And so that would be 2, and so the result would be 15. Okay, that's how you create the calcAverage function, and then I want you to use that function on the totals array. All right, so basically I want you to calculate the average of all the total values of the tips plus bills. Okay, so again, don't beat yourself up if this bonus one is too hard for you. Anyway, good luck with this one, and I see you here again in a minute. Okay, and let's start by grabbing the calcTip function from earlier. So that should be here. Okay. And that's why we keep all the code in one neat file like this. Next up, we create the bills array. And this one has quite a number of values, but we can just copy them. They're already almost in the correct format. So no and, but a comma. Then we create the empty tips and totals, const tips equals an empty array, and const totals another empty array. And now is where the magic starts. So basically where we will calculate the tips and the totals. So that is question number 3. So use calcTip to calculate tips and total values. So essentially what we will do is to loop over the bills array and then fill up these two arrays. So for let I equal 0, and we want this to run while the counter is less than the length of the bills, which is 10, and so the last index is 9, and so that's the last element that's going to be taken. And now in here, let's start by calculating the tip and store it in a variable. So const tip is equal, and now we're using the calcTip function. So we call it using parentheses, and now we need to pass in the bill value. And what is the bill value? Well, it is just the bills array at the current position. And now you might wonder why I am able to declare this tip variable here as a constant. Am I not changing it in every loop iteration? Well, actually that's not what happens. Actually, in each iteration, a new tip variable is going to be created. So we're not mutating, we're not changing the original tip that we declare here. In each iteration, we will simply create a new one. And that's why we can use const. Anyway, now we have the tip calculated, and so we just need to push it into the tips array. So tips.push, and here the tip. And finally, we need to push into the totals. So totals.push the tip plus the current bill. And we already know that that is bills I. Okay, and that's actually it. Now you could have done it in a different way. For example, without this variable here at all, you could have just put this code here and here. But then you would have calculated the value twice, and that's just not necessary. We just calculate it once, and then we use it both to push the value into the tips and into the totals. Okay, and now as always, let's check all the three arrays out in the console. And whoa, that's a lot of numbers. But just by quickly looking at them, everything looks correct. Great, that's really great. We basically just did the same as we did in the previous version of the challenge, but this time we did it using a loop instead of manually creating the array by calling calctip with builds 0, 1, and 2. So that's what we did in the previous challenge, but this one is a lot better. Because now, no matter how many builds we have here, the loop will take care of all of them at the same time, basically. Okay, so that's the basic challenge. I hope you arrived at the same result that I did, no matter how you solved it. And now let's go for the bonus here. So we're writing a function called calcAverage. So const calcAverage. And once again, I'm using a function expression here, which is my favorite kind of function, I would say. And as we said, we will receive an array, and any array here will work. So once again, we're building a generic function which does not care what kind of values it's going to receive. It can receive builds or tips or scores or heights or masses or whatever, really. It doesn't care what the values are. And that's also why I gave it this generic name. So it's just calcAverage and not, for example, calcAverage totals. Let's now do what we say, or what I say here in 4.1, which is to start creating a sum variable that starts at 0. Then as we loop over the array, we will keep adding the current value to that variable. So this time it needs to be a let, because this sum will of course be updated as we loop over the array. And now all of this is pretty standard at this point. So equal 0, I should stay below the array dot length. And so this time array is simply the array that we're receiving in this function. So it's this parameter. And now, as I said, as we loop over the array, we will keep adding the current value to the sum. So what I mean is sum will be equal the current value of sum plus the array that we received as an input at the current position. And that's it. We're just missing here the increment of the counter, but that's easy to fix. And this one here could be even more condensed. So let me just copy this one and comment out the original one. because remember that we have a more shorthand operator in JavaScript, which we can use when we want to update a value. So instead of sum equals sum plus, remember we can write sum plus equal array I. So this one is exactly the same as this. So if you prefer, you can write just this version, but this here is going to do exactly the same thing. Okay, and just to see if this works, let's actually test this now by logging only the sum. So console.log sum, and now again to test it, I will just call the function calcAverage with simply an array of some values. So 2 plus 3 plus 6. And we know that this will be 11, right? And so now we can test this function here just to see if this first part that we just wrote works. Let's see. And yes, we get 11. And so this logic here is correct. So we got this array here into the function. Okay, and so R is now 2, 3, 6. And so that's the array that we're then looping over. Okay, so we end up with a sum. And now what we want to return is simply the sum divided by the number of elements in the array, which remember is r.length. And that's it. We can now get rid of this, but now we need to log the result to the console if we want to see it, because this function here now does not log it, it simply returns it. And remember that that is a big difference. So we know that the sum of this is 11, and 11 divided by 3 is something like close to 4. So we could change this here to 7, then the sum would be 12, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. And so then we can make sure that this function works. So it is 4, so great. This means that the function now works. And so now we can use this function to actually calculate the average total. And so here we simply use the totals value that we already created before. And that's it. So the average total value of all our builds plus tips is 275 and 19. And let's actually do the same with the tips themselves, just to get an idea of the kind of tips that were paid here. So the average tip is 42.89. Hopefully that part here was not too confusing. But if you go slowly through the code step by step, you will understand it. All right, and with this, we finished the complete JavaScript fundamentals. So we made a ton of progress here. So congratulations for making it this far. Great job, really. However, as you know, we are really just getting started here. There is so much more to learn. And actually in the next section, we will quickly configure our VS Code editor a little bit better and also set up a better development environment. So that's going to be super useful for writing code a little bit faster. And I will also teach you some developer skills that every developer should really have. But as always, before moving on, make 100% sure that you understood all these fundamentals from this section and the previous section. So if you want, you can redo the challenges, or you can come up with your own small problems or ideas to solve. And by doing that, you will reinforce all these tools even better and ultimately become a better developer faster. Then, when you're really ready, let's together move forward.